All right, here we go as the first trial. This is going to be a quick review on the distributive property. When we're trying to multiply in coefficients, in this case our coefficient is a, into a set of brackets, it's simply remembering that you have to multiply this coefficient by each term within those sets of brackets. Now in class I call this bombing because as we do this, it's like bombing this into the bracket. So when you hear me refer to that in class as bombing or distributive property, those two things are the same. So if we look at an example, if I quickly jot down an example like 3 times x plus y, if we're using the distributive property, we would take that coefficient of 3 and we would multiply that into these brackets, and we multiply it by each of those terms. So I go 3 times x to give me 3x, and I go 3 times y to give me 3y. Now there's all kinds of other things that we have to remember when we are working with this distributive property. We have to remember about different signs, whether we're adding or subtracting, whether this coefficient out here is positive or negative. We also have to remember whether or not there's coefficients in front of these variables, if it's just variables. So the types of questions that you may come across may vary from question to question, and they're all going to have different outcomes. You just have to remember that you take this term out in front of this bracket, and you multiply it by each individual term within that bracket that follows. As a more complicated example, we could look at negative 2x multiplied by negative 3y minus 7. Now, the rules are still the same. You still have to multiply that coefficient, this coefficient, in this case a minus 2x, by each of these individual terms, minus 3y and minus 7, within that bracket that follows. So I take my minus 2x and I multiply into the bracket and multiply by minus 3y, and you remember that when we're multiplying coefficients and variables by coefficients and variables, that we multiply the coefficient by the coefficient and we multiply the variable with the variable. And in this case, obviously, you know that we're going to get x, y. So I go negative 2 times minus 3. Negative times negative is a positive, so that's going to give me 6, positive 6. And then x times y is going to be just x, y. Then I do the same thing. I bomb this in, or multiply using distributive property. I go minus 2x times minus 7, and we always carry that sign that's in front here, although we know that that's a subtract 7. We're going to call this a negative 7. So I multiply negative 2 times negative 7, and again, negative times a negative is a positive, so I'm going to get a positive plus 2 times 7 is 14. X times, well, there's no variable here, so we don't have to worry too much about that, so we're just going to be left with x. Final answer. Of course, with my equal sign. Okay, so we will look at this again in class tomorrow with a number of different examples and possibly a little quiz. We will see you tomorrow.